Welcome to the Touch MBA Admissions Podcast. Do you need help figuring out which schools to apply to or how to get into the world's top MBA programs? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others on this podcast and on our site, touchmba.com, as they seek the admissions edge. And now, here's your host, Darren Joe.
What up, guys? It's Darren. Welcome back to the Touch MBA podcast. Glad to have you here. So this week we are breaking new ground on the Touch MBA podcast. We've never had a guest like this before. His name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, and he's the author of the book, Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. And Dr. Gleb has extensive experience not only teaching, but coaching and consulting firms and individuals on how to de-bias their decision making. And of course, when I heard about Dr. Gleb, I wanted to talk to him about what he's learned in the context of career management and figuring out not only what business school to go to, but whether we should switch jobs, for example. So I hope many of you find this conversation helpful. As someone who tends to lean on his intuition a lot, I really appreciate Dr. Gleb's work and his book. I feel like, I have to get much better at identifying certain cognitive biases I have and working my way around them. So it was fun to read his book and prepare for this interview. And I hope to distill a lot of his book in a form that you can use immediately as you guys manage your careers and manage your business school decisions, where to apply, where to go, where to work afterwards. So enjoy this episode with Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm super excited to have our next guest on the Touch MBA podcast. He's an expert on a subject that I'm really curious about and that I truly believe can all benefit us. He's known as the disaster avoidance expert with over 20 years of consulting and coaching mid-sized and large businesses and nonprofits on how to make better non-biased decisions. I'd like to welcome Dr. Gleb Tsipursky to the Touch MBA podcast. Welcome, Dr. Gleb.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be on. Really appreciate it, Darren.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. And so I want to make the most of the short time we have together. I first want to ask you about, your passion for the subject. You've committed over 2 decades of your life to helping people overcome their cognitive biases and make better decisions. Like, what has inspired you to do that?
Well, actually, what inspired me to be fascinated in the topic in the first place is some pretty negative experiences I had as a kid. And so the typical advice we get about decision making is go with your gut, follow intuition, follow your heart, all of that. Now, my parents were very typical in this sense that they believed that they should follow their hearts. Unfortunately, their gut intuitions often opposed each other. So, for example, my mom, she liked to buy nice clothing, and my dad was kind of a cheapskate. So she'd go out and she'd buy a $50 sweater, and she'd come home, and my dad would yell at her, and he'd say, "No sweater should be worth over $20," stuff like that. And they got into it, and they got fighting. And so, as a kid, I saw them fight a lot over things I already saw were not very smart things to fight about, didn't really help the relationship or solve the issues. But the worst time was when my dad, he was a real estate agent, so his salary was variable. It was based on commissions. And there was a 6-month period when he made quite a lot of money, but he hid it from my mom, and he told her he made very little money, probably because he didn't want her to spend on sweaters.
Oh my gosh.
So he bought an apartment elsewhere and leased it out to some folks. And in a couple of years, once my mom found out, she was very angry. She was very pissed. They had this whole huge, big blowout fight, and actually then ended up separating for a while. So I lived with my mom, and I saw my dad pretty rarely in that period. And that was pretty traumatic for me as a kid. And so that made me realize the depth of bad decision making that adults can go to. And that made me wonder, why are we not taught decision making? Why did my parents not sit me down and say, hey, kiddo, here's how you make good decisions and here's how you make bad ones? Why did nobody in school teach me this? Why do people not teach this in college? Why is this not taught in business school? If you look at business school, nobody teaches decision-making classes in business school. You're taught about macroeconomics and microeconomics and whatever economics, but you're not taught about how you should make decisions as a leader, a future business manager. That's business management, right? So that made me really fascinated and upset and frustrated with our society. And so that caused me to study decision making. And I got into studying decision making. And that's when, once I studied it, people started listening to me. So I became a trainer, a consultant, and coach. And I've been doing that for 20 years, as you mentioned. And, once I started studying it, I also realized there were very slim pickings in popular literature on how to make decisions. Mostly it's, here's how this great business leader went with his gut to make good decisions, and supposedly, and therefore you should all act like this business leader. Not really helpful. So I went into academia to study how our mind actually works, the cognitive neuroscience and the behavioral economics of decision making. Cognitive neuroscience is the study of how the way that our mind is structured has various impacts on our behavior, including decision making. And behavioral economics is the opposite of the typical rational man, classical liberal economics model that is still taught in business schools far and wide. It's actually about how we, as human beings, actually make our decision, not the rational man model, but the emotional man, which is overwhelmingly what drives our decisions. So I studied that as well. And I've studied those things for about 15 years or so, and that's my academic background. So I combine the actual business, pragmatic consulting, coaching, training, case studies, and my academic background and the research from there in my newest book called Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. It's the education that you actually never get in business school, how you should make your decisions in order to survive and thrive in the modern business environment, whether it's to help you get into business school or to make up for the lack of education that you don't get in business school and that will enable you to succeed. So that's what I'm about, and that's what I focus on.
Yeah, and that's why I was so interested to bring you on as a guest, because I guess I'm someone that has relied on both or tried to rely on both, gut, or as you call it, the autopilot and the intentional mode of thinking.
Yes.
Right? And could you just take a moment to explain those two modes of thinking and why you titled your book Never Go With Your Gut, as in never?
Yes, happy to. So what the research about going with your gut shows us is that our gut is not adapted for the modern environment. Our gut, our intuitions, our emotions, our reactions, whatever your heart, whatever you call it, is adapted for the ancient savanna environment. When we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, and we were hunters and foragers. And that meant that it was very important for us to have certain instincts that enabled our ancestors to survive. Instincts like the fight or flight response. You had to jump at 100 shadows in order to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. You might have heard of it as the saber-toothed tiger response. Now, you might notice there are many less saber-toothed tigers in the modern world right now, but we still react to unpleasant emails as though it's a saber-toothed tiger. We have an outsized response to this perception of a major, major threat, which is not nearly as major as it seems. And then we are very tempted to make a very quick response, a defensive response or an aggressive response in writing the email back. Now, as you go forward in life, you'll hopefully learn that it's a bad idea to give in to the fight or flight impulse and write a quick email. Lots of people have learned that that's a bad thing to do, and that's something you shouldn't do. But that's what we're tempted to do. That's what our gut tells us to do. And that's just part of the kind of mistakes we make in the modern world when we rely on our gut. Another series of mistakes coming from the tribal environment is actually tribalism. In the tribal environment, it was very important for us to look for people who are like us, who had the same values that we do, who had cared about the same things that we do, who liked the same things that we do, because that was part of our tribe. Those were our tribal members. And if we were kicked out of our tribe because we weren't sufficiently like our tribal members, we die. And if our tribe fell apart because we weren't sufficiently supportive of it, we would die. So we're the descendants of all of those people who didn't die, who had very strong tribalism, very strong fight-or-flight responses, and opposed to, of course, the other aspect of tribalism is being opposed to all the people who aren't like you. Well, in the current environment, business environment especially, it's terrible for you to look only for people who are like you and to oppose people who are not like you, because we're in a multicultural global environment where you have a company that's 100,000 people and you have to work with so many people who are different from you. Or even if you're a solopreneur, you have to work with people who are very different from you if you want to survive and thrive and flourish in this modern business environment. But our gut tells us to not do these things. So that's the autopilot system. The autopilot system is the older part of our brain. It's the one associated with the amygdala. It's the emotional part of our brain. It's the impulsive part of our brain. And it's right in some cases in the modern world, when you're trying to get out of the way of a moving bus, you should not stop and think about what you're doing. That's a good time to get out of the way of the moving bus. But in the vast majority of business situations, you're not in a moving bus scenario. You're in a scenario where you have at least a few minutes to think about things. And here is where you really need to rely not on the autopilot system, not on the emotional part of your mind, but on the more rational part of your mind. That's called the intentional system. And that is the system that is responsible for logic, reasoning, abstract thought, numbers. It's the not binary system. It's the system that is able to think on a spectrum, to think about what is the likelihood of something happening. Your gut reactions, your autopilot system is very much black and white. This intentional system is shades of gray. And the intentional system can spot the mistakes that the autopilot system tends to make. And so the mistakes that our mind tends to make, which vastly come from the autopilot system, a few come from the intentional system, are called cognitive biases. These are dangerous judgment errors that cause us to make terrible decisions in modern business environments, as well as in all sorts of environments, when relationships, let's say, and so on. I could go into much more depth here. So the autopilot system, just in its natural, primitive, intuitive stage, it's very harmful. It's very dangerous because it often drives us in the wrong direction. So, for example, it drives us not only in business, it's in health as well. Think about the environment in which our ancestors were. If they came across a source of, let's say, apples or grapes or something like that, honey, they had to eat as much of it as possible in order to survive and thrive. So we're the descendants of those who were able to do that. Well, right now, when you come across a box of 50 cookies, you still want to eat all 50 cookies. It's just very tempting because we are very addicted to sugar from that ancestral environment. It's a very bad thing in the modern environment. And hopefully you've learned that, one cookie is okay, two cookies, but the third cookie, you got to stop at that third cookie. Unfortunately, that is not what our environment is like. Our environment gives us a box of 50 cookies. So you have to learn to restrain that impulse. And hopefully most of you have learned to restrain that impulse. So you have changed your autopilot system from the dangerous, impulsive, problematic habits that were the natural, primitive state to a more civilized state, which means adapted to the modern environment. That's what civilization is about, where you can restrain yourself from eating those 50 cookies. So you can only trust your gut reactions when you have retrained them in order to be adaptive to the modern environment. Just their natural impulses, the natural state where they're in, you can't trust them. And that's why I say never go with your gut. That's why I say always check with your head before you go with your gut, because your gut may be wrong, your gut may be right, but you can't trust it because something that feels comfortable, like eating all 50 cookies, may be exactly the wrong thing for you to do.
Yeah, thank you so much for outlining the differences, right, between those two modes of thinking. And it's almost as if you're saying sometimes your gut can serve you, but you need to put some braces or see your gut through a lens, right? An intentional thinking lens. And before we get into how to avoid decision disasters with your career, which is what I want to talk about, can you just bring forth some examples of when our gut does serve us from a career perspective? Because you did mention, right, that it's not irrational to follow your gut, is the way you wrote it in your book.
It's not irrational when you know that your gut is going to be in a situation where it's well adapted to the modern environment.
Okay.
So there are a couple of situations where that's the case. I already talked through the situation with the getting out of the way of a moving bus. Not so much of a career situation, but a career situation might be where you have a long-time business associate, and that is similar to the environment that is in the tribal environment because you are with a tribal member for a long time. And suddenly this tribal member is telling you something and you're reading this and you're suspicious of something, you're not feeling comfortable with it. That is a time when you want to have some more trust for your gut reactions, because that's what your gut is actually adapted for. It is adapted to seeing when your tribal member might be trying to create a situation with internal tribal politics that would put you on the outside and climb over you in the tribal hierarchy, because that was also very important for us in the tribal environment, to try to get to the top of the tribal hierarchy, because those at the top of the tribal hierarchy were the ones who got the most resources and were able to reproduce their genes. So we are the descendants of those who got to the top of the tribal hierarchy, and we have very strong social status seeking genes. So that is one of the dynamics that we are functioning within. So in that case, you might want to check very hard and kick the tires of that proposal that the tribal member in the current environment is making, that your business partner might be making, if you feel some suspicion toward that. That is a time when it's worthwhile to trust your gut. Now, another time when it's worthwhile to trust your gut is when you have trained yourself. There's a really interesting research showing that 10,000 hours of practice in a certain area can actually and effectively give you a good intuitions, good experience-based intuitions. You should never trust your intuitions that are not experience-based, because they might be very wrong. Like, let's say, to eat all the cookies, or in a more negative example, to discriminate against people who are not like you, because that is a very bad business decision. You are losing out on people who might be wonderful business partners for you. And you will also look for people who are like you, and they will be much more able to manipulate you if they know that you are only looking for people who are like yourself. And of course, one of the biggest problems I've seen, I do a lot of coaching and consulting for entrepreneurs, for people who hire others. And one of the biggest problems I see is when they hire other people like them. So for example, when somebody has I'll talk about myself here. I am optimistic, which means I suffer from the optimism bias. The optimism bias causes me to think that everything will be good, everything will be great, everything will be wonderful, to look at opportunities and not look at risks and threats and problems, to have high expectations of myself and of others, too high, exaggerate expectations, so risk blind. Many other entrepreneurs are like me, and I'm an entrepreneur. I run a 6-people consulting, coaching, and training company called Disaster Avoidance Experts, which is where the content is created. So there are many other people who are entrepreneurs who are like me, and what they tend to do when they hire others is they tend to hire other optimists, other people who are like them, who see the future as bright and wonderful and great. This is a big problem, because I'm the kind of person who has 20 ideas before breakfast, and I think all of them are brilliant. I've learned to my bitter experience that they're not all brilliant. But if you have a company full of people, if you're like a startup, and you have a group of 10 people who are the founders and the initial hires of a startup, and they're all optimistic because the founders naturally hire people who are like them, well, they'll all have 20 ideas before breakfast, and they'll reinforce each other. They'll say, you're all brilliant, and let's implement all of the things all at once. And that will be the end of the startup. There's a reason that about half of all startups fail within the first 5 years, about 2/3 fail within the first 10 years, and about 75% fail within the first 15 years, because of the bad decisions made by startup leaders, because they hire people like them and they don't understand how to structure the organization effectively. What is needed, what I do and what others people who are experienced do, is that they hire people who are not like them. So I make sure to get pessimists on my team. And to be clear, optimism bias and pessimism bias are on a spectrum. So there can be extreme optimists, extreme pessimists, and moderate ones. So I hire some pessimists on my team. And when I have 20 ideas before breakfast that I think are brilliant, I pass them on to the pessimists. And the pessimists look at them and they say, well, these are all half-baked potatoes, and maybe these three are worth finishing baking. So they're terrible at generating ideas, pessimists are. But they're great at evaluating ideas because they see all the flaws, exaggerated flaws of all the ideas, and they're great at fixing the flaws. So they can take those three ideas and move them and implement them effectively, which is not my strength. So that is a great way of combining. And that's just one dimension. Optimism and pessimism are just one out of very many different dimensions that you need to have cognitive diversity in the team, people who have different modes of thinking. And that's very not intuitive. So this is one of the biggest dangers. This is one of the big dangers of not being aware of all of the cognitive biases and making the wrong decisions, making the wrong hires. So these are things that you really need to watch out for if you're going to succeed.
Yeah, and I actually had a question planned for the end of our talk, but I'll just ask it now, which is, you outline throughout your book 30 or so cognitive biases that we have, right? And that we really have to look out for. And as you mentioned in your introduction, it's one thing just to know about these biases, right? We can all read about them. It's another thing to actually examine our past behavior, examine our current behavior, and change our future behavior, right? Using all these biases that you outlined and avoiding them. And I'm wondering, because, we're not programmed to do that, like you said, right? We've evolved to use our autopilot system more. What is your practice, or what are your best practices for getting better at spotting these biases in our everyday life?
So the first thing you need to do is learn which ones are most dangerous and powerful for you. My book, Never Go There Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, has an assessment in chapter 7, the last chapter of the book, which goes through all of the 30 most dangerous cognitive biases and looks at the behaviors associated with them and helps you understand how often they occur for you and or others in your team if you have a team. So let me give you an example. I already talked about the optimism bias and the pessimism bias, so I won't go into that. But the first question on the assessment asks, how many projects that you've done over the last year went over time or over budget as a percentage of projects? So whenever I asked this of a group of executives, of whether executive MBA trainees or actual executives, I most often present to actual executives, they give me an answer ranging from 5% to there was a presentation about 4 weeks ago where I heard 98%. So 5%, not a huge deal, not that big a deal. 10%, it's not that big a deal. When you're getting into the 30s, that becomes more of a serious issue. When you're getting into the 50s, that's a major issue. And of course, 98% is huge, big, big, big problem. Because if you're not really calibrating your resources well, then you're investing them in the wrong direction. You think you can do all these things, but you can't, or you're leaving some things aside. You're misallocating your resources and you're not achieving your goals. That's terrible whether you're an organization or an individual or a solopreneur who's making decisions. So you need to understand that our tendency, just for many of us, not all of us, is to have great confidence in ourselves and in our plans. And we feel that our plans will go according to plan, that everything that we touch will turn to gold, like the Midas touch, and everything will be great. Unfortunately, not the case. Our plans will often go wrong, will go awry. There will be many problems, many risks, many threats that we won't anticipate. So what we need to do for that is to deliberately introduce some slack into the system, some additional resources. If you think something will take you a month to do, give it a month and a half or something like that, and make sure that you don't schedule other projects for a month and a day after you finish this project, because something will go wrong most likely, and you need to give yourself time for that to happen. So that's a very fundamental principle, and you want to look for that. How often does that happen for you? If it happens often, then that planning fallacy is something you really need to watch out for. And of course, there are 29 more questions. So what you need to do in order to, it's not sufficient for you to learn about the planning fallacy. Now, now that you heard about the planning fallacy on this podcast, you're I'm laying the hands on you and you're cured. That's not how it works. You need to understand that this is an emotional habit. It's not coming from your logic. It's not like you suddenly learn that, 2 plus 2 equals 4, it doesn't equal 5, and therefore you know the right information and you go forward and now you are no longer deluded about what 2 plus 2 equals. That's not how it works. It's just as hard to avoid the planning fallacy as it's hard to learn to avoid the 50 cookies. And I'm very serious. It is just as hard to do that. It comes from your intuitions, from your gut reactions, from your emotions. Our decisions, according to research on this topic, are influenced by emotions. To about 80 to 90% of our decisions comes from our emotions when we just naturally, intuitively go forward. So the planning fallacy will be a powerful thing for you if you are indeed prone to it, unless you start learning about it and start changing your mental habits, just like you had to learn to change your mental habits to avoid eating the 50 cookies or, to put on your sweats and go to the gym. That's a hard thing to do. It's very tempting for us to come home from a hard day's work and, plop on the couch and watch Netflix the rest of the evening, just because that's what, in the savannah environment, it was bad for us to waste additional resources on something as seemingly pointless as doing exercises, right? So it's very not intuitive. And you have to learn and overcome those intuitions in order to actually go to the gym and do the hard thing. Similarly, you have to do that for the planning fallacy and for any of the other cognitive biases to which you are particularly prone to. To do that, you need to do the logical thing of learning about it and learning which ones you're most prone to, just like you did the logical thing of learning about healthy diet and healthy exercise. But then you have to do the much harder thing, the emotional thing of committing yourself to changing your behaviors on specific disciplined behaviors of healthy eating and specific disciplined behaviors of healthy exercise. And what I'm talking about here is just the same thing, just mental fitness, mental exercises to change your mental habits to be healthy ones. So you need to learn where you're most vulnerable and which ones you need to change. And then, much more importantly, you need to commit to changing them and keep this change going. And that's what the book is about.
Yeah, it's almost like you need some sort of great results, right? That come from changing your mental habits. And if you see, I'm starting to make better decisions and, this helped my career, this helped my business, then you're willing to employ, that work again. Mm-hmm. Let me bring this back to making career decisions, sure. Right? Because as you know, our audience is aspiring MBA applicants.
Yes.
They are in the midst of making great career change, whether that's going to business school or not. They're thinking of maybe joining another company. And, you mentioned in your book that you wrote that you should read this book if you're a professional who wants to avoid disastrous judgment errors in managing your present and future career. And that's what we're all doing here at Touch MBA. And so I'm wondering, what have you seen from all your teaching and coaching and training experience and consulting experience? Like, what are the biggest biases that people have when managing their careers? And could you talk to us about some of those, right, for our audience?
Yes. So there are a number of big biases that folks experience. And one of the biggest biases is the conformism bias, where people conform to authority. And that is the bias where people do what other people expect them to do. People think that, hey, the thing I should do is go to business school because other people go to business school and they tell me to go to business school, and therefore it's the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do because other people tell me to do it. They don't think about, well, what is the right thing for me to do? It might be to go to business school. It might not be. For example, if you are entrepreneurially minded, that might not be the right thing to do because business school is actually a very bad place to go to if you are entrepreneurial. Business school is not designed for the entrepreneur in mind. It is designed to produce managers for large corporate entities. That's the point of business school. And it's not a bad point. Let me just highlight very clearly. It's not a bad thing. There are huge companies. If you want to work in a corporate setting, in a large corporation, business school is great for you. It will teach you about these things. I mean, it's bad for the rational decision-making model because that is not actually how people think. So this is what my book is about. So don't buy into the rational decision-making model, but the way that groups function, institutions function, microeconomics, those are all useful things. However, if you want to create an entrepreneurial company, you will notice that very many entrepreneurs did not go to business school because that is not the kind of skills that people are taught in business school. To be entrepreneurial, to be creative, to be innovative, that's not what business school is for. So if you are expecting to get the benefits of being entrepreneurial and creative, business school will kind of beat that out of you. So you want to understand what are your goals, well, not other people's goals, not if you want to get the social status. So I was giving this is a good example actually. I was coaching one of my clients about 5 weeks ago, and she was in a large financial corporate entity company, and she was telling me, so she didn't go to business school, and she was telling me she got to a certain level, managerial position, and she's doing pretty well. She has about $200,000 per year job, and but she's seeing other people who are younger. She's in her 40s, so she's seeing other people who are younger get promoted to a higher level than her because they went to business school, and so she's seeing that those people who don't necessarily have her skills and abilities, but have the social status of going to business school and have the networks that come with going to business school being promoted above her. And she's seeing that that's kind of unfair. And she's thinking, well, should I go to business school and should I not? And should I stay here? Should I not? Maybe I should go to a place where I'm rewarded better. And I told her, well, a way that you need to think about this, and this is another problem that people run into who are making a career decision, is what's called hyperbolic discounting. We tend to greatly undercount our future selves. We tend to be very short-term oriented. That's what our gut intuitions tell us to be. In the Savannah environment, it was very valuable for us to be short-term oriented because it didn't make sense for us to plan in the long term. We didn't have resources that we could put in our banks and invest into the long term. It didn't matter if, Bubba, the caveman, he couldn't get an education in how to swing his axe more effectively, right? That was not something that people got taught. So it didn't make sense to get professional development. We are not intuitively taught our intuitions are not well adapted for the long term, because of the lack of ability to invest into ourselves or into our resources. We didn't have banks. We couldn't invest money. We couldn't do savings. So that is not something we're intuitively predisposed for. And we greatly undercount the long-term reward. So I asked her, imagine yourself in 5 years. What do you think will happen in 5 years if you don't do anything? Which is kind of what she was doing. She wasn't doing anything. And she realized that she'd be stuck in the same position, which is, again, not a bad position, $200,000 a year, not bad. But she didn't want to be there. She had a very visceral negative reaction to that idea. And so as a result of that conversation, she very strongly committed to working hard on the next step in her career, which likely will be leaving that place and going to a place where she's more appreciated. She decided that she doesn't want to take the time to go to business school, but she's also thinking about exploring the option of going to an entrepreneurial career and becoming a consultant. And so that is another option for her. So that is something that you need to realize is going to happen. Kind of the consequences of business school, the hyperbolic discounting, and the conformism to authority. So those are things I would think that people want to be thinking about, and in order to establish their long-term goals, where they want to go, not undercount the long-term and not conform to authority.
Yeah, and I think one issue that business school applicants have that cuts directly to both of those biases is rankings. Mm-hmm. And as an academic, I'm sure you have some opinions to give here, right? Because I think the first thing applicants will do is look at the rankings to decide where to apply. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there are any biases you see in that sort of decision-making model to apply to this subset of schools because, they're ranked top 4, top 5. Mm-hmm. What is your opinion on that?
My opinion on that, well, first of all, as an academic, I know that business schools do a lot of game playing to game the rankings, and they try to influence the way the rankings are determined in ways that are not necessarily beneficial to students. So the business schools are competing for rankings rather than competing for the best education to offer business students, because they know that having higher rankings will draw more students. So that's something really important to realize, that the rankings are not necessarily going to be indicative of the quality of the business school. That's one, just as a baseline. Second thing to realize is to, again, start from your goals rather than from the rankings. Why do you want to go to the top ranked business school? Is it in order to, for some folks, it might be the right decision if you want to do something that will actually be necessary from that perspective. So if you want to go to one of the consulting firms, Bain, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, that's valuable. So though they value having someone who graduated from one of the top business schools, that's definitely valuable. If you want to work in a top financial firm like JP Morgan, Chase, and so on, Morgan Stanley, whatever, those top financial firms, they value the business school top rankings. Most other companies do not. Just super clear to you, they don't value the top rankings. If you want to work at Google, they care nothing about which business school you went to. They might care, if you're a business manager, if you're applying for a business management position, they probably do care. They want you to have the business background, an MBA, but they don't really care whether you went to Stanford or to, Padang, college somewhere. They will not care about that. So just being very clear. So you want to determine your goals and then use those goals to determine your rankings. You should not say, I want to go to a top-ranked business school and just work on that, because that may not fit your goals. You want to determine your long-term goals. Where do you see yourself 10 years from now? Do you see yourself working at McCain or Bain or something like that? If you do, McKinsey or Bain, if you do, then you probably should go for that. But if you don't, then you probably should not go for that, because you will expend extra resources, extra effort of time, money, energy for nothing. You will hurt yourself and you will not really accomplish your own goals. Whereas if you go to something that's not top ranked, but you can devote additional efforts of money and time for other forms of professional development, which will better fit your long-term goals than going to the top ranked business school. So that's kind of my perspective on this.
No, that's great and refreshing to hear. I thought we could cover one section of your book, 5 questions to avoid decision disasters, to help us debias, right, our decision making. And I think this could also be applied to, for example, maybe people feel this calling, like they really want to be management consultants at those top 3 firms that you mentioned, but they haven't even spoken to people working those jobs, for example, or senior people 10 years in at Bain, what have you. So do you mind if we go through those 5 questions? Because I think that'd be super useful to our audience for whatever career decisions they make.
Yes, so in my book, I describe 2 types of techniques. One is for making huge major decisions. I want to be very clear. These 5 questions are not the questions that you make to make those huge life-changing decisions. These 5 questions are the questions that you make for everyday decisions that you don't want to screw up. Now, there are going to be many decisions in the process of applying to business school, which you want to apply these 5 questions to, but you don't want to apply these 5 questions to the question of, am I going to business school in the first place? So these 5 questions are going to be something that are going to minimize risk, minimize problems. They're to avoid decision disasters. They're not to make the perfect decision. They're to make a good enough decision. So that's the 5 questions. And there is a separate 8-step process in the book, which is to help you make as perfect a decision as possible. That takes about an hour. It doesn't take an hour to talk about them, but it takes about an hour to go through those 8 steps. These 5 questions takes about 2 minutes to go through them and help you avoid serious disasters. So, first question of the 5 questions to avoid decision disasters. What important information didn't I yet fully consider? So what evidence didn't you take into account? So let's say you are gathering information for potentially applying to business school. And like Darren mentioned, you haven't talked to someone who is currently a management consultant, even though you want to get into, Booz Allen Hamilton or something like that. You want to actually make sure to gather this information. Plenty of folks are available on LinkedIn and quite open to conversations. If you reach out to them and say, hey, I see you've been at, McKinsey for the last 10 years. Would you be open to, a 5-minute LinkedIn chat about your experience? Many people would be open, or say 15-minute brief phone call. Many people would be open to that. They'd be happy to share about their experience. So that's something that you can definitely get value from. Next, what dangerous judgment errors didn't I yet address? So what cognitive biases haven't you considered here? So let's say when you're gathering information, one of the biggest problems that we tend to do is called the confirmation bias. That's where we tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. So you want to make sure to look for information that disconfirms your beliefs. Try to prove that you're wrong. Try to prove that you don't want to be a management consultant. Take that time to do that. If you can't prove yourself being wrong, that's great. Then you're more likely to be right. But if you can prove yourself wrong, that's also great, because now you can make a better decision. Third, what would a trusted and objective advisor suggest I do? So think about someone who's a trusted and objective advisor to you. What would they suggest you do? You get about 50% of the benefit of this question just by asking it. And think about what you would tell a friend to do in this situation. So you get about 50% of the benefit. Now you get the other 50% of the benefit by actually calling a friend, or, if you are a millennial, texting this friend. How have I addressed all the ways this could fail? So think about your decision. Let's say you're writing an email to someone who you want to be your reference. How have you addressed all the ways that this email could fail? What if the person receives the email when they're in a bad mood? Think about that. That's possible. Anyone can be in a bad mood. Somebody can have some bad sushi, right? So how have you addressed the ways this could fail? Read this email as though you're in a bad mood, as though your stomach is hurting. Think about how a person would interpret it, and revise it in such a way to remove all ambiguity, make it as clear as possible, and to make it as positive as possible. So even if someone has some stomach pain, they would still not react badly to it. Finally, what new information would cause me to revisit this decision? What would cause you to change your mind? So if you are in a state where nothing would cause you to change your mind about being a management consultant, that's bad. There's certainly some information that you should be open to that should cause you to change your mind about being a management consultant. You want to think about this information. Be very clear and conscious about what this information would be. So, for example, one of the things that I was thinking as a when I was much younger, I might go to medical school. Now, one of the things that caused me to seriously change my mind about this was learning that medical doctors were one of the top professions of people who committed suicides because of burnout. And so that caused me to really change my mind about whether I wanted to be in a situation that caused burnout for so many people. Maybe you don't want to be in, maybe that's something, if you find out similar information about being a management consultant, that might cause you to change your mind, or something like that. You want to think about what information would cause you to change your mind and you want to think about it before you actually gather this information. Because when you're gathering the information without having decided in advance what would cause you to change your mind, you're going to be very biased, emotionally biased, and you're going to want to ignore information that goes against your preferences. But if you decide in a calm and cool and rational state that, if you find out that being a management consultant involves, working 90-hour weeks and you don't want to work a 90-hour week, then you can decide in advance that if you do find this out from someone who's 10 years in the field and they are very happy about working 90-hour weeks and they don't have a family life and their wife left them or something like that, you might decide that that's the time to change your mind about being a management consultant.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for walking us through those 5 questions. And I just have a few more questions for you, Dr. Gleb. One is, I can see this as a life mission of yours to help people, debias themselves and make better decisions and encounter the cognitive biases. You mentioned earlier that 80 to 90% of decisions are made by emotions, right? In general.
Yes.
By our emotions. What is the ideal scenario in your head that, the people you work with and hopefully most of society, right, can come to? Are we talking 70% emotions and 30% intentional thinking, or
that's not what I want. I want people to be in the same situation as the ones who don't eat 50 cookies. What people have learned is to change their emotions, and that's all that I'm talking about. You got to change your mental habits. You got to change your emotions about how you make your decisions. So right now, people who have learned to not stop at 3 cookies, they would feel not good about going for the eating all 50 cookies. They wouldn't have a positive emotional experience because they've changed their emotions, they've changed their intuitions, they've changed their feelings. People who have learned to love going to the gym and have a positive emotional experience about it, they have learned that this is, hey, it was hard to do it. When you were first learning how to go to the gym, it was a hard thing, but now they have a positive time. People who have, let's say, learning how to drive a car is another example. When you first, if you don't remember how to do, you've learned how to drive a car, it was hard. I can tell you that. I remember, I failed my first car driving test. Not an easy thing, but now it's much more calm. I do it on autopilot. It's not nearly as bad as it used to be. So that's where I want to get to. I want people to get to where they train themselves to make good decisions, and they still function 80 to 90% emotionally, but they have to retrain their emotions to make the right decisions. They ask these 5 questions to avoid decision disasters automatically as just part of their habit. So, interesting thing, there was firefighters in the UK were trained on a similar technique of asking 3 questions before sending their men, these are firefighting leaders, sending their men into the heat of the moment to fight the fire. And it was before they were trained on this, there was research showing that 80% of firefighting mistakes come from human error. So that's why there was the intervention of teaching them 3 questions. Now, after they were trained, it took them a couple of months to get trained on this and to start asking these questions as part of their habit, their mental habit. It was found that that the people who were trained on these questions were making decisions not only slower than people who weren't trained on asking these 3 questions that they were trained on, but they were making much fewer mistakes. So that's where I want to get to. That's where I want the world to look like, for people to automatically have this habit of asking the 5 questions and to calibrate, like I automatically run my brilliant ideas or ideas I think are brilliant by pessimists as just a part of my habits. So that's where I want people to get to.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experience and your time with our audience today, Dr. Gleb. How can, if they want to learn more, where can they follow you?
Folks can find my book in physical bookstores or online on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so on. Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. They can check my content out on disasteravoidanceexperts.com. Again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com. There's going to be videos, blogs, decision guides, podcasts, manuals, services like consulting, coaching, training. And you want to especially make sure to check out disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe for a free 8 video-based module course on making the wisest decisions and avoiding dangerous judgment errors. The first module of the course is actually the assessment on avoiding dangerous judgment errors that I talked about. That's also in the book. So again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. And I'm quite active on LinkedIn, and just like some of the people who are in, Booz Allen Hamilton and McKinsey, I'd be quite happy to share my experience and answer questions. So just connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm highly active there and available. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, GLEBTSIPURSKY.
Great. We'll also put a link to that in the show notes. And I one last question for you, Dr. Gleb. I'd like you to challenge our audience in some way. So, for example, what would you have told yourself in your mid-20s or as a mid-career professional in terms of how to make the best career decisions, how to unbias yourself, or just it doesn't have to be related to your book, but I just like to give you the stage to challenge our audience.
Probably the most important thing I would have taught myself in the young self in the 20s is to become much more aware of my emotions. I was not nearly as aware of my emotions as I should be, or as I am aware now, and how they drive me to make the decisions that I do. And having much greater emotional awareness would have been incredibly helpful for me in avoiding many bad decisions that I made at that time. So that's what I would have taught myself. And it's just emotional awareness is so important, because knowing when I'm anxious and when that's driving me to make bad decisions, when I'm angry, when I'm frustrated, when I'm sad, and that's causing me to do the things that are really, really harmful for me. So that's what I would tell myself, and that's, I think, would have been incredibly helpful for my younger self.
Thanks for listening to the Touch MBA podcast. Don't be shy. We have a mailing list. Go to touchmba.com and get yourself signed up. And we'll keep you posted with the best tips and insider interviews on how to get into your number one school. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook at Touch MBA. See you soon.